I would like to look at the various measures of well-being, not from the point of view of the general theory of well-being or general perspective of welfare economics. But I would like to put that in the context of this workshop, and especially the fact that the ecological transition is putting this question of measurement of well-being in a particular light. So what is now clear is that social progress can no longer be obtained from the destruction of the environment, right? So we have to become somehow responsible stewards of the environment, and that requires some decoupling of well-being from the use of material resources and from the degradation of the environment, right? So this is now becoming not just a necessity, but really even a vital necessity for us all. Now the question is that possible, right? And some people say it's actually not possible. And I don't have a firm answer on this, but I would like to discuss this question with you and argue in particular that whether the answer is positive or negative may depend on how we measure well-being, obviously, and that's the topic of my talk, but also, and that will be the conclusion, maybe it also depends on the orientation of individual preferences, and that's about our culture in general. Okay, so let me first talk about something that is kind of popular in not only in economics, but also very much in the public debate and especially in the media, which is to say, okay, we now have to move from a focus on GDP and economic growth to a focus on happiness. So we need to move from gross national product to gross national happiness, or something like that. And the now the huge provision of data about subjective well-being coming from surveys yield an interesting observation, which is that the data that we observe on subjective well-being seem to be, to some extent, disconnected from economic growth. So this is the gist of the Easterlin paradox, after Richard Easterlin, who was the first to observe that. And so the paradox, it's a paradox because there are two things that seem to go in opposite directions. One is that at any given time, subjective well-being seems to be increasing with income. So the richer people are better off than the poorer people. And that is true whether you observe that within countries or across countries. Right. So there is clearly an increasing relationship between subjective well-being and income. There has been some recent controversy about whether this is true for certain measures of subjective well-being, like happiness in terms of emotions, hedonic emotions. But this controversy has somehow been settled, and definitely there is an increasing relationship. Now, the paradox comes from the fact that if you look over time, not at a given time, if you look over time and over long periods of time, subjective well-being data seem to be pretty stable, even when you have important, substantial economic growth in the meantime, right? Like GDP doubling or even tripling in some context. And so that suggests a solution, an easy solution somehow to the decoupling of well-being from economic growth and from harmful exploitation of material resources and natural resources, which is that somehow subjective well-being is already decoupled, at least in terms of longitudinal data. And so if it's decoupled, then we could, if we have grown without harming subjective well-being, we could degrow without harming well-being as well, right? That's somehow the idea that would come up from these data. Now, indeed, I want to be a little more precise about how this paradox comes about. And indeed, there are several varieties of subjective well-being. And let me go over that very quickly. So you have purely hedonic measures which have to do with emotions, feelings, how people feel. That's where maybe the word happiness is the most appropriate. You have other data which are more cognitive, evaluative, which have to do with satisfaction with life. Okay, so these are different surveys asking people, how satisfied are you with your life, or this kind of question. And finally, a third category, I won't say much about it, the so-called eudaimonic category, has to do with people feeling that they have purpose and meaning in their life. This is less popular, less used, and I will focus on the first two in the rest of my talk. We observe something like the Stalin paradox, both for happiness and for life satisfaction. But maybe we can explain this paradox in a different way for both of them. Now, I would like to argue that neither happiness nor life satisfaction are measures that can really help us address the problem of decoupling. So what's wrong with happiness? Why would I not recommend to use it instead of the usual economic statistics? Well, happiness is stable over time, presumably because there is a feature of human psychology, which is this tendency to go back to a set point, to a sort of stable, normal state, even if the circumstances tend to change. And so this is an adaptation phenomenon, which is great. Actually, it's great for human psychology. We can adapt to a great variety of circumstances. This is sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. And I have nothing against that. But this phenomenon of adaptation, of course, is pretty bad in terms of measuring people's situation, because if their psychology, their mental health is able to adapt to various situations, that doesn't mean that people are indifferent to these different conditions of life. So if they are not indifferent, but we declare that these happiness measures are stable, and we rely on that, we will betray people's concerns in life, right? We will not respect their goals in life. They may want certain things that if we don't see the impact of that on their emotions, then we'll say that this doesn't matter after all. And that is probably a judgment that is incorrect. At least it is not respectful of people's preferences. So you might object and say, well, if people are mistaken about the impact of their decisions on happiness, so too bad for them. Really, happiness should be their ultimate goal, or is the ultimate goal of people. And that was the argument of Jeremy Bentham, who introduced utilitarianism famously. But I think that's wrong. I think that emotions are not the only goal for many people. Many people have goals that have to do with other things that are especially more objective than just emotions. And there is this famous argument by Nozick, who suggested that if we had the choice between living a difficult and challenging life, or having a very happy sequence of emotions, but just by being a brain in a vat, we would probably, most of us would choose the difficult life rather than just being a brain in a vat. And so this is the kind of argument discussing the problems with the hedonic approach. So that's the issue about happiness. Now, let me turn to the other thing, life satisfaction. Why is it problematic? So it is less clear, it is less settled, the reasons why life satisfaction is stable over time. It may be or it may not be a matter of human psychology, but there is something like a satisfaction treadmill, and there is there are various possible explanations, and I will come to that. But there is also a special measurement issue, which is a bit different, a bit more specific than for happiness, which is that people have to give a score to their life when they declare their satisfaction, and this score has to be in a bounded scale. So many of these questionnaires are giving a numerical scale from 0 to 10, from 1 to 7, and so forth, and people have to give a number. And so when people construct this number, this is something that they have to do when they answer the questionnaire. I don't think that people walk around having this number in their mind before they meet an interviewer or a survey. And so this construction of a score is likely to generate a lot of differences across people. And heterogeneity is problematic because if people construct these numbers in different ways, this will make these numbers non-comparable across people. And so here are various reasons why people may not be comparable. First is just the pure issue of scale use, which is quite familiar to the people working on health economics, for instance, where people are asked to rate their health. It's very, very well known that there are heterogeneous ways of scaling, of scoring one's health in the population. And so we have something similar with satisfaction with life. And there is interesting recent work by Dan Benjamin and co-authors, Aurea Fetz and Miles Kimball and a few others, on the fact that some people seem to be high graders and others seem to be low graders, no matter what you are talking about with them. Okay, so there is a psychological trait that is to be a high grader or low grader, and you can test that in a questionnaire on issues that have nothing to do with well-being. And then you ask people their life satisfaction, and you will see a correlation between being a high grader in completely irrelevant matter and being a high grader in life satisfaction. So there is just this issue of scale use. There has also been interesting work on differences across cultures. So there are, for instance, cultures linked to just the way in which grades are normally computed in various countries at school, especially in elementary school, and that shapes the culture about what a grade means. The other issue that is likely to trigger non-comparability of answers is benchmarking. People may they put a number of their life thinking of a reference group or thinking of their own aspirations and compare their situation to what they would like to have and so on. And so the heterogeneity in reference groups or aspirations makes these answers non-comparable. And this actually was very well documented by one of the creators of these surveys, Cantrill, who exactly asked about what people had in mind when they were giving numbers, and that really was clearly showing that there is a lot of heterogeneity in this respect. Another thing that may happen is a bit more cognitive, has to do with people's opinion about their position in a relevant distribution. So it's a bit like comparing to a reference group, but it's in terms of not grading, but in terms of thinking of giving a grade from a statistical reasoning, right? If I'm above the median, I'll give myself something above 5 out of 10 or something like that. So there might be various issues like that. And so if people are misinformed about their position in the distribution, which is typically always the case, this will lead to problems in their answers. And so there is a very interesting recent work by Alberto Prati, sorry, there is a mistake here, and Claudia Senig, so Prati, not Prato. And they have noticed a discrepancy between the stability of life satisfaction over time and the fact that generally people recall when they ask, what was your situation a few years back? Generally people recall an improvement in their situation, so an increase in life satisfaction. And they were, in many surveys, have been asked, what would be your grade that we would give now on the life that you had 2 years ago or 5 years ago? And so you see an increase, and what they've done, these colleagues, is to construct the hypothetical curve that is just the cumulative curve of these increases that people say in their memory questions. And by doing this reconstructive curve, what they obtain is a new curve that, unlike the usual stable subjective well-being curve, gives something that's increasing, and in some of their computations, it essentially completely espouses the curve of GDP. So this is quite striking. So that strongly suggests that the raw data coming from subjective well-being surveys, and especially life satisfaction, are definitely not comparable over time. And as I was suggesting, likely not comparable across space and social groups, either across countries and so on. And that is problematic also for the measurement of inequalities. So if we can't have this easy fix of relying on subjective well-being data, what can we do? So there is one idea that I want to explore more here, which is to fix the subjective well-being data and to try to correct the biases and the problems that I've been talking about. So the exercise done by Alberto Prati and Claudia Senig is an example of the kind of correction that could be made. But I would like to explore something a bit different, which is closer to economic theory and has been developed by many economists over decades, which is preference-based approaches. And preference-based approaches avoid this problem of the shifting of the drift of the scales that you have with life satisfaction, because they measure well-being in objective units. And but they do that, even if it's in objective units, they do that in a way that nevertheless respects individual preferences. So that may sound a bit mysterious, but it's very simple. If you think of real income, for instance, okay, so income, nominal income corrected for inflation, that's something that typically, if you have more of it, and you're only considering your life from the lens of private economic goods and services that you can buy on the market, greater real income is something you prefer. And so using real income is something that will respect individual preferences, and that's an easy thing to do. Of course, our life, fortunately, maybe unfortunately for economists, but fortunately for human beings, is not just made of private economic goods and services. And so we also live with public goods, and we live with a lot of non-economic goods. And so we have to incorporate that in the measurement. And that's the challenge of these preference-based approaches. We have to incorporate things like health, social relations, relation to nature, and so on. And so let me give you two examples of solutions that have been proposed by economists. So one is money-metric utility, sometimes also called equivalent income, which has been proposed a long time ago. It started with Samuelson, and then there has been a tradition after that. And the idea is to correct real income by the individual's willingness to pay for the other aspects of their situation. Okay, so you may have, for instance, a certain income and a certain health. What would be the income that would be enough for you if you had good health? So essentially, it's your income minus your willingness to pay for a good health. That gives you an equivalent income in good health. And you can use that as a measure that somehow eliminates the heterogeneity in health and in preferences over health that you see in the population. So the OECD, for instance, has computed this kind of measurement under the name of multidimensional living standards, and you have several applications in various areas. But this requires, unfortunately, there is one complication here. Unlike the questions of life satisfaction, which are very simple to ask, how satisfied are you with your life, and take very little time to answer, the average or the median time of answering this kind of question is around 14 seconds, 1/4. So it's very, very short, very easy, very cheap. If you want to do a preference-based measurement, you need a survey on preferences. You need to elicit people's willingness to pay, and that's a much harder thing to do. And there is also an ethical issue, which is that you have to pick the reference situation against which willingness to pay is computed. So when I talked about health, I was taking good health as the reference. Maybe it's a natural thing to do. And so the idea here is to take the best option, the best situation in people's eyes. That's one option that is popular in the literature. Another option that has been proposed as well is to take some kind of average situation. The advantage of the latter is that then you have a reference that is closer to most people's situation, whereas the best in people's eyes may be actually quite far away from where they are. That's one option of a preference-based approach. Another option is the use of von Neumann-Morgenstern utilities. For the economists in the room, that's something that's well known. For the non-economists, just consider that these are functions that are supposed to represent people's preferences, but in a way that can also represent their preferences over risky prospects. There are risk attitudes. And this is done by computing the expected value of these functions, of these utility functions, over the risky prospects. Right? Now, something that is not always understood by people is that these utilities are measured in objective units as well. So equivalent income obviously is measured in monetary terms, but von Neumann-Morgenstern utilities are actually measured in probabilities of gain. So probabilities are also an objective unit. Sometimes, I mean, it can be up to a scaling factor that needs to be chosen, and that's an issue, but it's an ethical issue on top of it, but especially if you want to compare across people. But that is also something that is really preference-based and respects people's preferences, but nevertheless uses objective units. And this, like the previous example, this approach requires complex surveys because you need to elicit preferences, and you also, on top of that, need to elicit risk attitude. Right? So this is, unfortunately, much more respectful of people's preferences than the subjective well-being data, but of course, more complicated. Now, let me come back to the question that motivated this talk. Right? So if we look at these measures like equivalent income or Vanderman-Morgenstern utilities, can we think of decoupling happening, right? Can we really decouple social progress and well-being from the destruction of the environment? It looks like it's impossible, right? So these two approaches, the two examples I gave, are respecting individuals' preferences in the following sense. So let me be clear about that. What it means is that if these measures are stable, that means that people are equally well off as before in their own view, right? They consider their situation has not improved and has not worsened. And if these measures increase, then people feel that they are better off than before in their own view. I'm assuming here that people's preferences are not changing between the two periods. But if their preferences are stable, then they are well respected by these measures. But the fact that these measures are in objective units like money or probabilities of payoffs seems to make decoupling impossible, unlike what we have when we go for purely subjective data. And I'm afraid there is something uncomfortable here, an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore would have said, which is that typically people prefer to have more in many domains. Right? And so they want to have more transportation. So some millennia ago, walking was the main mode. Now people dream of space travel. People used to talk for communication. Now they talk to people all over the world by video and so on. And soon maybe we'll have holograms all over the place. And same for information. Now we have an amazing amount of information that's just one click away through the World Wide Web. So all of that is something that shows that we are actually insatiable in many dimensions. So that is a bit frightening if we want to decouple well-being from, if we measure it in this way, just because people want to have more, right? So if we respect their preferences, then we seem to be in trouble. Nevertheless, I would like to give some positive, some hopeful messages, because we can imagine some substitution from material to non-material goods, and we can promote that in our policy. So we can, for instance, help people invest more in social relations, in the quality of social relations, and a lot can happen there that is not really consuming a lot of resources. Same with culture. Culture, broadly speaking, we can help people invest more in arts, in sciences, and so on, education. All of that can be something that is taking the place of other things that are more destructive of the environment, and could make people really well off, even according to these measures. Likewise, health is something, so health is a pretty material thing, but nevertheless, it can be improved, not just by having very expensive, fancy healthcare system, but also by improving our lifestyle. So for instance, there has been this interesting report of the agri-food economic system analysis that has found that if you compute the negative health externalities, so the people dying from obesity and all of the problems due to bad nutrition, you find that the value of these negative externalities, taking account of the value of statistical life years, is 50% more than the value added of the whole agri-food system, right? So somehow this system is doing more harm than good. Of course, it makes us still alive because we need to eat something, but nevertheless, it's quite amazing that we have such staggering negative externalities that can be solved, that can very easily be solved, and that could improve well-being quite a lot. And same for sedentary lifestyle, which can really be changed and can improve health a lot, while reducing the use of fossil fuels and material resources. So a lot can be done. That would be improving people's well-being, including according to these measures, while reducing the destruction of the environment. That's one element. So substitution from material to non-material goods. The other thing that can be done is we can improve maybe not so much individual well-being, but also social well-being, what we call in economics social welfare, which is a bit of a misnomer because welfare is also used to describe, in normal parlance, it's used to describe social policy. But social well-being can be improved by obtaining a more equitable distribution of resources, of power, of social relations, and so on, And this would improve the measurement of social well-being when we embed in this measurement some priority for the worse off, right? So if you think of the admonition by, for instance, ATD Fourth World, this NGO that says that we should evaluate a society by the fate that it gives to its worse off. If we focus on the worse off, really, we can improve a lot social well-being by improving the distribution. Okay, here is another important decoupling wedge where we can do a lot for social progress without without harming the environment. And finally, the last issue I would like to mention, and I will close soon, is the issue of sufficiency, right? So what about the idea that there may be too much? Can we imagine a more radical idea, or where we would say sometimes too much of certain things is really too much and should be curbed? It's interesting to notice that all the measures are not well adapted to tackle, to incorporate this idea. Equivalent income, for instance, the first example I gave, is not well adapted to the situation where you have preference satiation. What can happen with equivalent income is that it will plateau if people have too much, but it will never go down when too much is provided to them. Because when you give them a lot, they can always choose less if they want, but essentially that will give something that is just a plateau on the measure itself. VNM utilities, so the one Morgenstern utilities, can accommodate satiation without any problem, so that's an advantage of these measures if we wanted to do that. It's a bit hard, I think, to defend the idea that there can be really too much when we are talking about opportunities for an individual, right? When we say that there can be too much, it's not so much that it's bad for the individual himself or herself, it's that it's bad because of the spillovers, because of the externalities on the planet and on other people. And so I'm not sure that sufficiency is really what we should be after here. Maybe what we should be talking about is something more like responsible preferences, which would be taking a more collective perspective on life, right? So considering that my well-being as an individual should take account of what happens to people and to nature around me. And if I incorporate that in my view, then having too much for myself becomes something that I can consider to be bad from this broader perspective. Okay, so I'm stopping here. You see, there might be behind this idea of responsible preferences, there might be something like an ideal of changing our culture and moving away from an individualistic, materialistic culture and towards something that is much more attuned, much more focused on non-materialistic dimensions of well-being and more collective aspects, more collective perspective on life itself. I'm afraid I'm not presenting any evidence for that, but I have the impression that if we really want to decouple well-being from the destruction of the environment, we have to imagine a change of culture and not just a substitution, keeping our culture constant. We really need to imagine that the culture itself will change, and this may have to do with some proactive policies in education, in media, and so on, and maybe not just waiting for this to happen spontaneously. Of course, this is it's always a bit frightening to talk about changing people's culture and so on. It looks like a brave new world. So we have to be careful. The question is more like a positive question here. Is it possible to really decouple if we don't manage to have this change of culture? I don't know, but I'm afraid the answer is negative. Thank you.
So thank you for this presentation. I am Laetitia Dillenzeger from the University of Siena, currently doing a postdoc with Stefano Bartolini, and so also working on subjective well-being indicators. And first, I just would like to highlight that at the international level, with the World Happiness Report, for instance, we can find some variables that actually are not economics, that actually explain differences in subjective well-being among countries. And it's also the variable that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, such as social relationship, social support, trust, freedom to make life choice, quality of institutions. So these subjective well-being indicators, such as life satisfaction, also can give us some insights. So I'm not sure we should completely throw this away from the reasoning of developing new metrics beyond GDP, because I agree that the interpersonal comparability can be quite challenging. But at the meantime, when we have longitudinal data, we can actually see different economic situations or life situations that may affect individual well-being. And we are quite good at identifying that, such as the impact of unemployment on subjective well-being. And also, so this is one point. Also, I think there is other way to measure subjective well-being that maybe can avoid some of the bias that you mentioned. So the reconstruction methods, experience sampling methods. But this is more maybe less feasible it's less feasible at the national level, let's say. So I just wanted to highlight this point, and maybe we can have also a bigger reflection on which kind of multidimensional indicators we want to target at the European level. So what has been done, for instance, with the OECD Better Life Index, things like that. So I would like your insight about these other kind of indicators also. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yes, so at first I agree very much with what you said in the beginning. And indeed, I myself have been involved in some work that used subjective well-being data to estimate preferences, right? So they can be useful, especially panel data, which eliminate some of the problems that we have in cross-section analysis, where comparability is potentially problematic. But even panel data are not perfect, and so I'm not sure that we can really be confident about these estimates, and so they are now considered to be quite unreliable because there can be unobserved variables, there can be a reverse causation, and so on. So it's not clear exactly what we can draw from this data, and that's why I would advocate that we never use this data without correction. And probably what we need to do is to invent methods to correct for all the biases and the measurement errors that can come from the raw subjective well-being data before we use them. These methods have not yet been fully invented, and new ideas always come up. And I mentioned just two of them in my talk, like this correction for scale use, or the issue of using people's memory, and so on. But I'm still convinced that we cannot use these things directly. And regarding long-term longitudinal data, so the day reconstruction method, for instance, that you mentioned, this is something that has to do with happiness, right? So it's about feelings, and I think we can be pretty confident that feelings are not the thing that we should measure as a comprehensive measure. So mental health is super important. So feelings, good emotions, that's an important dimension of life, but it's one dimension. It's not the whole of life. And considering that this could be the whole of life is a philosophy that is very questionable, right? So it's essentially the hedonist philosophy is there is a big tradition. Jeremy Bentham, and from Jeremy Bentham to Richard Layard, you have a lot of people. I mean, Richard Layard is not a pure hedonist, but you have many people, many authors in this field, but I don't think they represent something that is acceptable for the whole population of the world. And so I would not, as much as I agree that emotions are important and mental health is important, I would be very much against using that as the measure of well-being, as a comprehensive measure. Now, regarding the Better Life Index and this sort of thing, so these composite indicators have a problem, which are that the weighting that is used is completely arbitrary, in the sense that there is no rational argument that can be done to justify using various weights for these dimensions of life, right? So that's the problem with the composite indicators, that say, okay, you have these dimensions in life, and now we'll try to find some weights by convention Okay, so maybe we can come up with some convention, but if there is no theory, no kind of argument that can put some rationality in the choice, that's really a problem. Unlike what we have with the two examples of theories I've given, the Bondman-Morgenstern and the equivalent income, there we have arguments that eliminate some of the arbitrariness that we could have in the measurement, because we can have pros and cons of all the choices of the parameters that can be adopted in this measure. So yeah, I hope my answer is clear enough. But thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. It's not at all my topic, so the question will be kind of naive. Sorry. The first one, I will be the devil advocate, and I want to see how you react. I say, okay, we are facing this big problem of climate change, and you may think, well, there will be a cost, and the cost is that the purchasing power of people may decrease if we make effort, the required effort. And then you come and you say, yo, no problem. Yes, it's true that the GNP and the purchasing power decrease, but your well-being can increase. So it's not like speech so that you explain to the people that they will consume less, but they should be more happy. That's my first question. I can ask the second one, so I am done. The second one is to say, well, I give you a little anecdote. When, okay, my chairman hates when I speak about psychoanalysis, but anyway, I speak a little bit. When psychoanalysis went to the States, they react in some way, but they make it short, they make it compatible with the American way of life. And a lot of books emerge about how to be happy. You can buy this book in the station, how I can speak in public, how I can be happy, how I can be organized, and so on and so on. I hope we don't buy too much this book, but we may say, and that's more the psychoanalysis approach, that there is huge diversity of preference, to use your vocabulary. You can be narcissistic, you can be paranoiac, you can be depressed, you can be over-optimist. And after all, well, you like or not Elon Musk, but is somebody really over-optimist, he will change the world. And so it's not compatible with your theory of too much. Yeah, and if you go in the business school, I haven't been in a business school, but they don't really teach you not too much. They say you are breaking the world, you will be the first, you will earn a lot of money. So how do you make this big diversity of preference, what I call preference, but it's not really preference, on the individual bias, and my example of Elon Musk compatible with your theory? That's my second question, if it makes sense, I hope. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, André. Let me try to put sense in that. Yes, indeed. So the first question is, yes, indeed, this is the idea, right? The transition is costly in purchasing power, but there is a lot of, we could call that reserves. We have oil reserves that need to stay in the ground, and we have well-being reserves that need to be extracted. And so a lot can be done in this respect. And so this idea of substitution from material to non-material dimensions of well-being, this was very much about the possibilities to increase well-being in spite of a reduction in economic living standard, right? So if you have excellent social relations in your neighborhood, if you have public goods that replace some of the private goods that you use to consume, and so on, a lot of these things can really help. And if you are healthy because you take your bike instead of taking your SUV, and so on, this improves your life considerably. and reduces your use of material resources. So if instead of going vacations to very far away countries, you do something good for your neighborhood and so on, a lot of things can be done that go in that direction. So yes, I would definitely bite the bullet, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding your question. Indeed, a lot can be done to improve well-being, even in the definitions I suggested, which are preference-based and are not just subjective well-being, right? So even definitions that somehow respect the fact that people are pretty materialistic in our current culture, even with that, a lot can be done to improve people's well-being. And that is something that we should. So again, this image of leave oil reserves in the ground and extract well-being reserves, that may be the image we should really promote. Now, the second question about the diversity of views. So these preference-based measures are totally comfortable with the diversity of values in life. That's totally okay, and you can accommodate that without any problem. Now, what about the too much thing, right? So that's a bit different. And as I said, I'm a bit skeptical of saying that there can be too much in an absolute sense. I think that what is easier to argue about and to convince people of is that there can be too much with respect to the consequences that this has for the planet and for other people, right? So when Elon Musk wants to travel in space and to send a car in space and so on, we can say, okay, this is not something that is helping anybody on Earth, and actually it's harming a lot of people potentially. So and so that's the issue of the collective perspective, and there I'm not quite sure how to do it in the best way, right? So I didn't develop that, but when I said we should probably imagine having a more collective approach to well-being, that means that people's preferences should be less focused on themselves, on the self-centered situation, but also include a broader perspective on how they relate to other people, how they relate to nature, and so on. And so that is something that is less well settled in economic analysis, but can be done. I mean, there is literature on it, and it's not as if nothing had been tried. So it can definitely be done. There are still some issues to be discussed, but that's how I would frame this issue of the people who are somehow insatiable, like Elon Musk. We have to somehow look at the preferences that would incorporate consequences on other people. And if we can't do that, well, then we are back to a situation where we just have to consider that as externalities, and we have to curb externalities in the usual way. But if preferences somehow could incorporate that, that would make our life easier, because people would more spontaneously take that into account.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe one addition is that this has to be said early on stage, in the sense that it's really a question also on education, because you, in a sense, you cannot tend to the student, you have to start to learn to read before you go to school, because you have to be the best, and you have to, because there are only a few positions at Econ Polytechnic, and if you are not in Econ Polytechnic, you will have a very bad life, and at the same time have your speech. So I think compatibility of speech is important, and this value, which I respect that you discuss, should exist also at school, I think. Should be conveyed at school. Or you think it's more a question of parents or books? How this value could be conveyed?
Yeah, there I don't have any particular expertise, right? I have the impression it's given the emergency we are in, the urgency of the situation, right? We cannot wait for a completely new generation to take over. So somehow the efforts have to start for all people of all generations now. But it's true that education is something that is super important and can shape values. But I'm not too optimistic about investing too much. Putting too much hope. That's what I mean in reforming education, because the education system tends to be the mirror of society, right? So whatever you hope for the education system, it will be somehow always falling back into the mold of the society from which it emerges. So yeah, if we could reform the education system from scratch without having any external influence from society, somehow we could imagine doing something perfect. This will never happen. The education system just reproduces what society is doing most of the time. But I mean, I don't want to be too negative about education, but I'm just saying we should not put too much hope in education itself.